everybody, and welcome. I am here with Jeff Sandis today, one of our key speakers for our Reclaiming Conference 2025. He is a freelance journalist and contributor based in the Vancouver area who submits most of his copy to the Epic Times. He covers topics such as crime, political developments, public safety, health mandates, and vaccine policies in Canada. It's great to have you with us today, Jeff.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
I would love to hear a little bit about what initially drew you to journalism and how you came to work for the Epic Times.
Okay, well, it's a big gap, but back when I was a teenager in the high school I attended, I mean, everybody knew me as the writer, I guess. I wrote all kinds of things and forevermore. It's all I did. And a counselor recommended a program that was in Vancouver where I lived, and I went and I attended that program. It was a 2-year diploma program in Vancouver. It was an excellent program back when I would argue journalism had a lot more integrity. I had some great jobs. My first job was covering the professional hockey team in Vancouver, the Canucks, for 3 years. I also wrote for our community newspaper, which was fabulous. I loved doing that for also a few years. And then I took a gap for about 25 years before I felt called back into it 3 or 4 years ago. And as I was looking at the landscape of journalism, I didn't like any of it, but I ended up stumbling onto the Epic Times, and I finally found one that I thought the journalism integrity was better than the rest that I was seeing in Canada. In fact, significantly better. And they had a call out for recruiting writers. I didn't fit any of the criteria, but I did apply, and I guess I did well enough in the interview for them to give me a shot. And I just have a contract with them to submit whatever, whenever. And yeah, so that's sort of I end up with them. And I have also submitted copy to some other outlets as well, but my first start is with Epic Times.
That's wonderful. I'm curious, what specifically was it about Epic Times that was different enough from other journalist avenues that made you want to commit to being a writer for them? What were other journalists or publication companies doing that you didn't necessarily agree with?
The truth is, we all are pointing fingers at our media and our legacy media in particular. And the term fake news is on all of our lips. I would think most of us feel like we're smart enough that we can kind of read through the clutter or anything that might be misleading. I was trained on how a story was supposed to be covered. I was trained on how to survey the landscape in whatever region it is you are. So if you're writing for a community newspaper, you're looking for community events and things of local interest. If you're writing on a national scale, you'll want something that'll appeal to people in Quebec as much as it might appeal to somebody in Saskatchewan. When I was seeing the state of journalism, and I saw it in real time decline, and it rapidly fell off of a cliff. The thing I found about the Epic Times is they didn't have the sort of editorial slant that was creeping into every other article that I seem to be stumbling on or reading or looking for. For the most part, I kind of abandoned even keeping up to date with Canadian events and things in BC. There was just nobody that I felt was doing a professional job anymore. All the stories I was reading with Epic Times seemed to have a pretty neutral approach. And I felt if I'm going to try and contribute in this area from which I was trained so long ago, they seem to mirror the most of what I had been taught to do. So I really appreciated that.
And was there a specific event or a story? You said you kind of started out in journalism, then you left for a while, and a few years ago you decided to return. So was there something specific that sparked your desire to go back to being a journalist?
There wasn't anything specific, but I did see the decline gradually building. we could probably say about 12 years ago. And where things really went off the cliff, I thought, was when Donald Trump became a politician. And, the age of internet has diluted I guess, the pool for finding news. And so when you have a demographic that is coming back to you and reading your articles or listening to your programming or viewership, it looked to me that everybody and every outlet was just trying to hang on to whatever that demographic was. And so, you go back 20 years and you can see a news website that would have like a wide range of options, from entertainment to politics to international news to sports to everything. And then as the consumer, you could kind of click on whatever you wanted, but then it became so narrow, and like everything just became a political issue, even if it had to do with, a teenager starting a recycling program. uh, I I just found that there was no professionalism left in the industry. And I guess something in my heart was just telling me, like, man, you should get back into this. And I'm not sure if I can kind of put my finger on whatever that pulse was. I made one call, or I made one outreach, and that was two epic times. And yeah, and the rest is history for now,
The
I
rest is
guess.
history. Well, what ways do you think that mainstream media is failing its audience?
It's a pretty broad topic, but I can give you a couple of examples. One, depending on the outlet, depends on what stories are considered news. And we used to be in an environment where, so here in Vancouver, we have two daily newspapers. We also have a couple of national newspapers, and then you have the local community newspapers. And when something was noteworthy, everybody would be there to cover it. So a good example that I will use when I speak is I used to listen to National Post Radio. I would come on at 4 a.m. my time in the Pacific time zone, and it was a good kind of coverage of what the Canadian headlines would be. A few hours before I signed in or tuned in, on this one particular day, there was a terrorist attack in Spain. I believe it was Spain, and Canadians ended up dying in it. So that was always the banner story for every news outlet across Canada. This just happened. We're getting details. Dead Canadians. We've got to tell the country. When I tuned into the program, their their opening segment was only on, we finally got Donald Trump. He is proof that he's a racist. And they referenced a press conference that he had the day before, which I listened to in its entirety, and I never heard it. And I'm like, what are they talking about? And that's all they were doing, popping champagne, high-fiving each other, because the producer and the host hated Donald Trump. And this was the most important thing in their sort of reference point. And so this is what they were going to talk about. And before they went to commercial, they said, oh, there was also a terrorist attack where some Canadians died. We'll get to that story too. And that would be an example of where the breakdown on how we go toward our public to get them informed. We're now selecting what counts as news, and it's depending on which home team or which jersey we're wearing from a political perspective determines how we're going to deal with it. So essentially the way it goes now is a media outlet is going to take who their team player is in politics or philanthropy or business or whatever, and whatever they do wrong, how can we make it look like that they're doing something good? And the person that's our opponent, what are they doing well? How do we make them look bad? It's part of the landscape now. We also have, there's an oversight body. They oversee how we end up writing. A lot of it's grammar, but a lot of it'll be things so that the news consumer, when they hop around from one media outlet to another, that we're all uniform in something that we need to be. And the best example was when there was a military coup in Burma. The military that overtook the country renamed the country Myanmar. So are we going to call it Burma or are we going to call it Myanmar? So they'll tell us what we're supposed to do. So here's an example of how they behave now. During the George Floyd riots 5 years ago or so, the riots we had to rephrase as protests. So what they wanted to do is take away the severity of what was actually rioting and make it sound so that it wasn't as violent. We just had protests throughout America against these immigration and customs enforcement raids. We're not calling them protests anymore. We're calling them demonstrations. So we're moving into very soft language for things that really are violent. And my guess is in another couple of years, we're going to be calling these same riots something like educational workshops or something ridiculous. So these are a couple of examples of how our media is failing the consumer and keeping us uninformed. I will add one other point that has also changed in the landscape that is not the media's fault, but it is a reality as well. And that's depending on the outlet that you work for. If you reach out to a politician in particular, if they say, oh, this person's with Epic Times or this person's with CBC or whatever, we'll talk to them. We're just going to pretend they don't exist. And so we get ghosted. In BC, the NDP government that's been running our province for several years, I've probably reached out at least 24 times to the Ministry of Health for comment, for interviews, for data. Not once have they gotten back to me. And my guess is they have no voters that read the Epic Times, therefore they're not even going to bother. So that's another problem that comes about. So even if a media outlet that you yourself might consider an adversary because you can't trust them, you don't like how they may have people that are trying to do a balanced job, but they're not going to be getting the same information from balanced sources to outline it for the consuming public. So that's another problem that's on the landscape as well. So there's 3 examples for you.
Those are great examples. And what do you think causes this antagonism toward the opposite side? Because we see it both from the conservative and the more liberal movements, just an unwillingness to have conversation with each other at all. Why do you think that is?
Well, I do blame our media entirely for this problem, but certainly social media has become a lot more of a game changer on how we view things, on how we form our opinions. But the biggest problem now is because our media outlets, they don't, like I said, there's a terrorist attack in Spain where Canadians are dead because they don't all cover that story. They don't all lead with that story as an example. We as consumers are migrating to the sources that are just going to reinforce what we already believe. And so, because every news source either paints Donald Trump or Pierre Poilievre or Justin Trudeau as the best thing ever or worse than Hitler, like we don't have, like we've made that decision what we think of Trump, Trudeau, or Poilievre. Therefore, we go to the site that's going to tell us what we already believe. And they don't want to lose us as a subscriber, as a viewer, as a listener. So they just keep pumping out the same information. So I think those things do contribute. And the other point is we've lost an ability to communicate with each other. So if somebody wants to discuss tax policy or immigration or really any issue that is now all political or cultural that kind of are boiling, over with, we pick our spots and they've kind of been determined for us. So you're either like a liberal or a conservative. We don't have a mixture anymore. And those groups have kind of determined how we stand on every issue, where you might have once been conservative with tax policy and gun rights, for example, but more liberal with things like social programs or abortion. But now, if you're going to say you're pro-abortion and pro-gun, each side is going to be saying, you got to pick which side you're on, and this is our our standpoints on those issues. That's not entirely the case, but that has, I think, happened because we're only getting information from one side predominantly. And that's with all our social media too. Like, we don't have a balance of people that have different opinions on Facebook and Signal and Twitter and everything else. So they're all kind of telling us the same things, and we're participating in it a lot like that too. But if our media were to go back and covering all these stories with equal coverage and equal priority, I think we would make some inroads there. But I don't think it's going to be happening anytime soon.
It is unfortunate. It definitely will take a major cultural shift, I think, to get something like that to happen. If you were to sit across the table from a young journalist who is wanting to start their career being nonpartisan, how would you advise them to go about that?
Yeah, I would. Well, when we were studying journalism, we would have a newspaper we'd put out, and then we'd have a postmortem afterward. And one of the instructors, they would go through everything with a fine tooth comb, and they would point out everything that they determined could use some improvement. And what I think I would probably do in a circumstance like that is take an issue that has some controversy to it and ask them, how would you, if I was your editor and I assigned you this story, how would you pursue it? And then what I would do is look to just inform them of how we would have done it 30 years ago, and this is the spots that you're missing. Before I would do that, I'd probably ask several questions just to sort of see if I could give them a few roadblocks or something like that to see how they would maybe adjust or adapt. But Chloe, I'm still in touch with the class that we studied with, and those who stayed in the industry, like from 35 years ago till now, like, they're disappointed too. Like, the quality of the product doesn't matter anymore. All that matters is how many clicks a headline gets. So if you're running a community newspaper, well, in most cases you're the editor of two or three in different cities, and you just have to get this content out there. And you hire somebody out of journalism school, and they all tell me, the ones that are in these leadership positions, they cannot break in and get them to think differently. It is an activist job now, and I don't think people get into it because they're good writers. They get into it because they think that what they passionately care about is changing the cultural fabric or the attitude or the mindset, and that's the drawing factor of wanting to have that role. The power of the pen has some leverage, but at least the people I studied with are saying, man, I can't even teach these kids. They don't want to learn, and there aren't mentors there for them to learn from. It's a different world out there, and the newsroom is completely different now. Whereas you used to all gather in one building and get your assignments, go out into the field. Nobody goes out into the field hardly ever anymore. Sometimes with TV journalism, I'm sitting here in Vancouver writing stories that are happening in St. John's, Newfoundland, and that's pretty much standard now. So we're really disconnected. So it's a lot easier to kind of fall into your own, just your own bias and let that take over. And for the record, since I've come back in, doesn't mean that I've made any difference or that I've even acted professionally. But I know that this is one of the characteristics of this industry, which has given it such a bad reputation, and it's well earned.
Mm. It seems like you are doing a lot though to try and redefine journalism, and it seems like you and the team at Epic Times cover a lot of topics that others avoid. Honestly, how is it that you all go about deciding what stories to pursue?
Well, in my case, I will pitch a story idea to the editor, and I will outline how I'm going to try and cover it. So which type of people I would look to interview and what type of research I would add. to try and get some background. And then he gives me the thumbs up or thumbs down. I write the story, I submit it. Most of the time they'll edit and publish it. I would say sometimes they make my stories much better, and other times I feel they've done a terrible job. I shouldn't say it like that. But they have a job to do there too, and sometimes they felt I was outside the boundaries that I was assigned. So what they do is they kill the story. So that's how it works, at least with me.
So, recently, what has been the most challenging story that you've worked on and why?
Mm. Most of the stuff I pitch, they're not. See, one of the things that happens in journalism now is the goalposts are pretty narrow. So let's say the government issues a press release on something. Let's say they're cutting people from the civil service. So they'll have a press release, let's say. And I would say I'll cover this. So typically, what does the press release say? See if I can get one interview, maybe two, that would be able to comment on it in some fashion and put it together. 800 words later, it's up on the website. This happens a lot because journalists don't typically make enough to earn a living. So they have to get a lot more copy out there. And, they'll be looking to write two stories a day or one and a half. Um, and so they have to find ways to cut corners. What I will do, this is just a part-time gig for me, and I have a full-time job. So the money is less important to me, and I want to get as much into the story as I can, which sometimes creates a problem because you have sort of a word limit that you're supposed to put in. The most difficult one that I had was related to the BC nurses, and there's a lot of controversy that was going on about those who had been fired for not getting a COVID vaccination. And I had all these different people that were giving me some really good information and background from all sides, and to find a way to put it together. I found that the editorial staff with Epic Times was really struggling. They were phoning me and asking me questions because I wasn't clear here, and uh, that was a tough one for them to put out. And this is one of the other things that kind of comes in, is if you're going to put something that's more in depth together, where you have multiple interviews, you have other articles that you're referencing for context, you have research. That's a lot more editing and vetting that a copy editor is going to have to do. And so the editor, the managing editor, has got to make some decisions. If you think it's going to take up too much time for his staff, which is pretty thin, then they may have to say, no, we're not going to do that story. But that one with the nurses, yeah, that was the toughest one I think I've ever had to kind of cover. Most of them, it just is, how do I get all these interviews and all these great quotes and context and data in under a sort of a word count. But that just takes me a little extra time, and sometimes it clicks and other times maybe not. And so that's what the copy editor will try to reframe and put together. But most of the stuff I do, yeah, it's not that challenging in that regard.
And now you are one of our keynote speakers, and you had the chance to jump on board our Reclaiming Conference team back in 2023. So I would love to hear a little bit about your experience a few years ago with that and why you've decided to come back again this year.
Mm. That particular conference, they did have a component that was dedicated to media. And one of the organizers did reach out to me and talk to me about that. And there was four of us on a panel. Well, we each had a presentation, and there's four of us that served on a panel. And then we had somebody that moderated and asked us questions. Uh, I, yeah, like I said, I've been wanting to educate people on how misleading journalism has become and try to give people the ability to see where, they're not able to tell when they're being misled or lied to even. My experience, I was the last person to speak, and the fellow that was before me, he actually covered the majority of what I had also planned to cover. So um, he did a great job, better than I would have. So I mean, it's good that he did. I would say that the big challenge for us was to try and come up with solutions. Though this is a this is an industry that, one of the things that I won't go in that direction, but I don't know where we can reclaim journalism exactly. I mean, I think if government funding was turned off, a lot of these outlets would have to look themselves in the mirror and decide what they're going to do. So that could be one thing. But we're trying to come up with ideas, and there wasn't a lot at that time, and I still think we're in that sort of setting where I'm not sure where we make a difference. But the one part that I think my lane is most apt is to try and say, like, look, this is what they're doing, this is what your media sources are doing. Here's how you can ask questions and rethink perhaps what your position on and anything, Mark Carney, Gaza, uh, tariffs. We're only getting like a framework of all of these big issues that uh, reflect the media outlets that we're going, or the social media that's coming into our feeds. So if people are educated, there's an easier way, I hope, where we, like you and I, can say, I can challenge you on something that you think is working or is not working, because I can tell when we both watched a particular media outlet describe what happened, I can say this is where they kind of omitted some things, or they didn't ask these questions, or this is how it's supposed to be presented. So that's my goal, is to try and help people recognize that. I've also been paying attention to the cultural divide that we have between liberal and conservative. And I did a story one time where it was a drag queen story time event, and there was about 200 people there. They had protesters to the event and supporters to the event. And I interviewed a whole bunch of people on both sides. And my last question was, do you know why they're here, either protesting or supporting? There wasn't one person who had any idea what the other point of view was. That's a big problem in our society today. We think we're right on Mark Carney and tariffs and Gaza. Whatever our opinion is, we can't believe that somebody thinks differently than us, but we don't even know why they think that. I'd like to try and help people see why people look at an issue differently, because that's another thing our media is failing at doing, is they're not presenting that side,
Mm.
or the other side. That
Would you say that this conference provides a good opportunity for people to learn how to talk to each other?
my experience the last 2 years, because I came and covered it for the Epic Times last year. So they had phenomenal speakers that were very educational, and I think also challenged us to think. But for the most part, they were already talking from a viewpoint that most of the audience already supported. And the effort to try and bring in, a more diverse opinion base from speakers has been challenging for the
Mhm.
organizers, from what I understand. And the 2 years that I've been out there, that's what they keep telling me, is they invite other people to come and participate and help try and present different points of view, especially on issues that are controversial or have become controversial, on our landscape. There's very slow progress by the sounds of it. And I know when I, made my submission, my main wish from this conference is that we would be able to bridge that gap at least somewhat.
Yes, and that's I mean, honestly, hopefully, if we achieve the goal, is to create an environment where we can have conversations and maybe disagree with one another respectfully, and if nothing else, at least gain some tools and knowledge to learn how to do that better. But to our listeners, if you all liked what you heard and you're interested in hearing more, I highly encourage you to check out our website, weunify.ca, where you can get tickets for our Reclaiming Conference and can come join the conversation yourselves. We hope to see you there. And thank you so much for your time today, Jeff.
All right. It was great to talk with you.